Hi, welcome to episode 38 of the American Tributaries podcast, where to break out of the bubbles we've all been living in these last few years, we're using modern technology to explore the various currents of people in our great country, kind of like a 21st century Lewis and Clark journey. I'm your host, Michael Whitten, and thank you for joining me in this exploration of America. Today, I'm so very thrilled to be joined by Mónica Guzmán, who lives in Seattle, Washington, and is the Director of Digital and Storytelling at an organization very near and dear to me, Braver Angels, and is also the author of a book I consider the definitive handbook of civil civic engagement, which is called I Never Thought of It That Way. Mónica, thanks so much for joining me today. How are you doing? And could you share a bit of your story?
Yeah, I'm doing good. It's a weekday morning here in Seattle. The kids are just getting up. Uh, yeah, and it's winter, which is nice. And I've actually slowed down some of my traveling. I've been doing a lot of traveling around the book, which has been fascinating. But December decided, you know what? We're just gonna stay put.
Yeah.
Uh, and that's been great. So it gives me a chance to read some other books for a change, instead of writing them, and that's been really cool. And sharing my story, I guess I'll just start by saying I've been a journalist my whole career and take very seriously my a mission to help people understand each other. And so in the last several years, when I just started to feel like just telling stories as a journalist wasn't really enough because of this foundational brokenness at the base of everything, this polarization. So I got really interested in studying that, um, and I ended up, you know, doing several things, including organizing a trip so that urban Seattleites who were liberal and conservative, rural residents of a place called Sherman County could get together and meet. And that just gave me even more of a sense that, hey, there's something here. We got to keep going. Ended up, starting to write my book, largely inspired by my politically divided family, and yeah, and ended up joining Braver Angels, which is the largest cross-partisan nonprofit working on depolarizing America.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's quite a mouthful to,
Mm-hmm.
to share. You've been up to a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so what came first then? Like your idea for the book or joining Braver Angels?
Oh, the idea for the book. So most of the
Okay.
book was totally written before I joined Braver Angels.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And do you? I guess like with all of your effort, like, do you think? I guess I always look at like the 2016 election as I don't even know if it was a turning point as far as making us polarized, but at least is where that the polarization became revealed. Um, do you? I guess would you agree with that or not? And then I guess, do you think there's been a change one way or the other since 2016?
Yeah, no, that was the big November 9th, 2016 was a very strange day for any mostly liberal city. So waking up that day in Seattle, I remember I had a meeting downtown that morning and my co-founder and I were both like, do we go? Like, has everything canceled? Is it like a big weird snow day, sick day across the city? Like, what's going on? We ended up going, but it was a very strange, it was a strange meeting and a strange day. So I think it's true. It was true, at least among liberals. What's funny is, uh, several years later, I talked to my mom, and she's very conservative and voted for Trump that election. And we were starting to talk about that time, and I realized that I had assumed that she was as surprised as I was that Trump won that election. And she goes, I wasn't surprised. I knew all along. And I was like, come on, mom. That's not true. Everyone was surprised. She's like, I wasn't. It was all you liberals, weirdos who weren't listening. I'm like, fine. So, yeah, I mean, it was certainly an asymmetrical shock, you know? Can't,
Yeah.
can't say that it spread evenly across the political divide, maybe.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, like your book, you talk a lot about like siloing and bubbles. And I think that to me was, I guess it's something that I kind of keep returning to that idea over and over again, obviously, even with the podcast. And I think to me, what I would say is that I think we all live in bubbles. So I don't like when I talk about that, I don't try to make it sound like, it's like a self-loathing type thing. I think we all live in bubbles. I think the problem is when you live in the urban bubble, because there's so many more people and because you
Mm.
are seeing in some respects more of a mix of people, you get deceived into thinking you know more than you really do.
Mm. I
I,
think
I
that's
I don't
part of
know if
it.
that's the case, but I think that you kind of miss out on the fact that it's still a lot of people live in very different
I think
circumstances.
that's absolutely right. I do think that there is a kind of bias being in a city because all the intellectuals are here, all the entrepreneurs are here, all the people who are making lots of money are here or whatever. And so I think we do fall into a trap of all the diversity that matters is here. And so I can expect to be exposed to all of the ones that really matter. And so
Yeah,
whatever diversity is not here probably doesn't matter.
right,
So someone is rural, then they're just out of date and they should get with a program, like that
right.
kind of thing.
Yeah,
They're whoever all my friends ran away from.
right.
It can get pretty cruel and weird. And I'm
Yeah,
not saying like I it's not like I see those beliefs all the time, but I could speculate.
and I think it's easy to fall into that mindset.
Yeah.
And I think to me, like one of the things that I've tried to be more at least aware of is the limitations of my experience, but it's also that I guess my feeling on this, and I realize like I say this as a white heterosexual able-bodied. I was raised Christian. I'm kind of agnostic now, but like it seems that like the notion of diversity has expanded in a healthy direction. I think across like since I grew up like the 70s and 80s. Like
Mm.
I'm probably brought this up before on the podcast, but there was this book called like Truly Tasteless Jokes out in the
Mm-hmm.
70s and 80s that I remember seeing, and they're just awful, right? And they were lazy, and it was just so simple minded and bad. And I think we've moved past that kind of sense of humor, that kind of simplicity,
Yeah.
and I think we're in a better spot than we were. But I think we need to go past that to even understanding that diversity is even more complicated than that. And I
Yeah.
think that's the hard part. And it's not going to happen overnight at all. It might take a generation or more to kind of fix or to continue to progress.
Mm-hmm.
But diversity has to be about rural and urban. Diversity has to be about the different kinds of the different kinds of jobs. Like I've made this point before. I think like that. It's easy to get together with a bunch of lawyers from different races, but can I get a group together where it's a lawyer and a firefighter and a doctor
Mm.
and a nurse
Yeah.
and a guy who stocks the shelves at the grocery store? No, I couldn't put that kind of
Yeah.
gathering together, and we need to think more of that.
Yeah. I think that'd be great because you're right. That's the kind that nobody thinks is a priority. That kind of mixing, right? Class is a really tough thing to talk about in America. It always has been, but it seems particularly tough now
Yeah,
because I think some of the orthodoxy sort of has other explanations for everything that you might think is a class problem. No,
yeah,
it's a race problem. It's just race.
right,
Well, we sure? Like,
yeah,
I don't know, man.
yeah.
So yeah, class is extremely awkward for America.
Yeah, and I think to me the other thing with race is that I think it's always like I guess if you're going to try to solve a problem, and I guess maybe this is a pragmatic view, but if you're going to solve a problem, then you should look at it through every lens, race
Hmm.
being one of them, but class being another, opportunity, education, whatever else there is, and I think that to me is I guess what's given me kind of comfort. I think in some respects I gotta say like Braver Angels, and I don't know if you remember in like December 2020, but like just hearing those voices to me and with all the angst and anxiety that was going on at that point was a transformative moment for me. It was really a
Hmm.
tipping point. Um, but in some respect, and it was a great source of comfort, but I think in many respects, it's also made me feel a little more uncomfortable because there are less things that are unquestioned.
Yeah,
I find myself
yeah,
more kind of questioning a lot of things, and I can almost see why people would want to just be like, you know what? No, this is all unquestioned. It's a lot easier
yeah,
to just kind of not question things than it is to
yeah,
kind of feel like everything is, should be at least a little suspect.
yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's sort of in some ways the choice in front of us. Um, do we just accept what seems soothing and comfortable and mostly right, and then just say, you know what, we're just gonna roll on with this, or do we try to chase some friction to the things that we already believe? And for a lot of people, there's enough stress in their lives that they just don't want to add any friction, and that makes a lot of sense. But if too many people make that choice, we're only going to get more toxically divided.
Yeah. Um, do you like I've actually found like and you seize upon that with your book about curiosity, but I've found that curiosity is both, I guess, a shield and a wedge. Like it's both offensive and defensive. Because I find if you find something that you're scared of, being curious both lets you avoid, I guess, feeling uncomfortable, but it also lets you to kind of understand the person that you're trying to, you know, connect with. But I guess what I was wondering is, do you have any thoughts as to why people have become less curious? I mean, I have my own thoughts, but I was just wondering, you know, what your thinking is.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is tracking with the fear and anxiety about the world. So we know that fear tends to make us want to close in and find our people and ask fewer questions, mostly just figure out how to survive, how to thrive, how to flee, whatever is making us feel under threat. So a lot of it is fear. You can't wonder about what you think is out to get you. You're going to call it bad and you're going to get away from it, or you're going to try to kill it. That's kind of it. So there's been so much anxiety over the last decade. It just keeps rising and rising, and it's kind of this thing underneath it all. And in some respects, I think that anxiety feels like it's being almost glorified, and it's justified in that there's plenty to be anxious about. The question is how anxious, and how much of that anxiety is useful. And I think some people just don't bother asking that.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I guess there's two things that I find, we've I think emailed off separately about like just like my thoughts about like journalism, but like to me, I think the two things that seem to be, I guess, most. I mean, insidious is a strong word, but I think that it's had such a negative impact that I'll use the word insidious. Is that like journalism doesn't cover local issues anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're left being, as a New Yorker, you're more outraged by politics in Texas and Florida than you are by the problems in your own city.
Mm-hmm.
And what that ends up doing is it makes you actually it makes you more ignorant because you're not on the ground in Texas or Florida, so you don't know what's going on. And you are pretty powerless to affect what's happening down there other than just kind of throwing money.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like in some respects, by focusing on those things that are far away, you're actually made to feel less empowered
Mm-hmm.
and more dependent on saviors, you know, like the
That's interesting.
politicians who come forward and say, I'll fix this for you because you
Yeah.
can't do it. You need me.
That's a great point. Yeah, I think
So,
there's something about the omnipresence of media and information. We're drowning in it. It's everywhere.
yes.
And the social media type sense that we ought to have an opinion about everything.
Yeah.
That makes it seem like we have enough information to have an opinion about everything. And then you apply that to the wide map of the United States, and it's exactly that dynamic you're talking about, which I've kind of been worried about for years, because as a journalist, I did a lot of engagement type work, community building, audience engagement, and I noticed that there's such a difference between the person with that strong opinion and that outrage, who hasn't been to your community, who doesn't know what it's like to be there, but is perfectly comfortable judging it from afar and feeling threatened by whatever's going on in your community as if it's coming for them next. And it's such a shallow level of understanding. But again, it's kind of, I mean, who's gonna say that it's too shallow? No one stands to benefit from that. So that's the way we look at things. And I think since the pandemic, there's been so much more of a globalization of a certain kind of, yeah, like somewhere in our mainstream culture, there is this sort of globalization. Like we know all about all the places in this country, and we can judge equally well, so many different lifestyles and things, and we know where they fit, and we have them in a narrative, in a spectrum from good to bad. And it's missing so much. It's ridiculous how much it's missing. And like you said, I mean, I also know, I've been there, right, for a lot of the closures in local media. I was at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer when it became the largest daily paper to close in the modern era. I was one of 10 reporters that stayed on, out of a staff of 174.
Oh,
It like
wow.
decimated the way that we could cover Seattle. And Seattle's a big city, so you would still hear a lot about it. Think about all the suburbs and towns that are just gone. I mean, there are all these regional, suburban, even weeklies that are gone. Yeah, it's just, why tell stories about communities unless they are going to get the attention of the whole nation? That's the only way maybe you'll get enough clicks.
Right.
And so Anyway, I could go on and on about the media
Yeah.
picture of it. I don't blame any journalists because everyone I know in media wants it to work for the people. It's just the economics of it aren't really easy.
Yeah. And and the other thing, but I think the other thing is, I know, like, for me, growing up, there's always there's this connotation that, like, if you want to be important, you need to get past your local community. If you want to be important, you have to
That's
get
right.
to a national level or an international level. It's more impressive to be the global head of something, or
Absolutely.
to worry about local. And I think, like, what I'd say is, even if you look at universities, the universities will, and this ties into what I'm trying to do in parallel with this podcast, is universities will push, internationalization. They'll push all the broad programs they have, but there's really no effort to talk about learning more about our country. Like, there's
Mm.
no, like, they don't have satellite campuses in other
Hmm.
states. Like, you're not at NYU doesn't have a campus in North Dakota to learn about the middle of the country, which is very, very different.
Mm.
But they probably have offices, they probably have campuses all over the rest of the world.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think urban becomes the urban ties become more important than any kind
Yeah.
of national
And I think,
ties.
to me, that's where, like, when you look at some of these, like, the nationalist movements, if you will, I think a lot of that is kind of, it's all actually interconnected, because it's really like the rural
Mm.
people in England who feel forgotten are same as the
Mm.
rural people in America. Like, the
Mm.
people who have this global network continue to obsess about global things and are
Mm.
worried more about Paris and London and things around there than they are worried about the communities up the interstate.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I think I can see that. I can see how some of the make America great again is sort of saying, "Hey, we're part of America too."
Yeah. Right. Like, just our concerns need to matter more. And I think,
Mhm.
there's, and I think that, to me, that it's more just about balance. It's not to say that you forget about the rest of the world. This isn't about, like, kind of going into, like, a 1920s style isolationism, but it's more about saying, I think we can right the balance just a little bit to have more concern and empathy and curiosity about our own country.
Yeah.
That shouldn't be a crime to say that. But I do feel like there are more people saying that, even specifically, and obviously with, like, what your book and all that you've been doing, you are reacting to that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Now, the other thing with media, and I guess we'll talk about, but, like, the I feel like a lot of media is kind of still has the DNA of, like, 100, 140 years ago, whereas, like, if it bleeds, it leads.
Mhm.
And I think that that's when you're talking about the fear, and we talk about some of the stuff. Like, I don't really feel like it's necessarily there's any one person that is, like, doing anything nefarious. It's like you had said, it's like the economics and it's the incentives, and it's the way that they've been doing. But I would say that I think the media institutions, at least the ones that have been around for a while, have done a major disservice by continuing to do if it bleeds, it leads
Yeah.
24/7 across all media spectrum.
Yeah, I think one of the most awkward dilemmas is that I mean, people talk about the harm, right? The harm of certain ideas or engaging certain ideas that could be harmful, it could be untrue, and all these kinds of things. But we don't often talk about the harm of too much anxiety and too much fear. When I was a young journalist, there were all kinds of workshops at the trainings I would do or the conferences I'd go to. I remember hearing about fear mongering. I remember hearing about the problem of it bleeds, it leads. I remember lots of good conversation about how to make sure that you don't accidentally, unwittingly make people more afraid than they ought to be. Take a small incident and blow it up. Something that's proportionally maybe quite small and make it look really big. And I'm telling you, sometime in the last several years, all those conversations went away. I don't see anyone talking about that anymore. And this, I think, leads to another awkward thing about journalists. A lot of the research tells us that when you are really consumed by the news and political news, you tend to be more agitated and be more afraid and be more, all of these things. Journalists are consumed by the news. We have
Yeah.
to be.
Yeah.
So I think that I'm afraid that journalists aren't really sure how not to end up exacerbating fears because they are among the people most afraid.
Yeah.
So they reflect that, and it's very difficult to say. I think for a lot of journalists, it's just, well, the fear is real. I'm going to keep reporting on how bad everything is, and I don't know. A lot of that really is perception, and we have to be so careful because there is harm in too much fear.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that on the flip side of that, I think there's so much beauty and empowerment in being curious and exploring.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
what has your, I guess, experience? What, I guess, what led you to wanting to write the book? And then, like, can I ask, like, over since you put the book out there, you've actually had more reason to be out and exploring the country even more. So, like, what's been your experience with all that?
With what piece in particular? Just
Well, let's go
the
with, like,
reaction to
since
the book?
you wrote the book and you've been out in the country now promoting it, talking to people about curiosity, like what have you learned since, from the promotional experience for the book?
Well, one of the lessons out the gate that I thought was pretty great was that this really actually is a hot topic across the political spectrum. And while I was writing the book, I had all kinds of fears myself. And one of the bigger ones was that people on the more partisan edges would just reject this outright as complete both sidesism, or the harm of other ideas, or that kind of thing. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen at all. I mean, every now and then I might see, a review with something like that. Just to, somebody who's just really, really entrenched in something, going, I can't believe you're even talking about talking to them. Um, but for the most part, absolutely not. Everyone from Glenn Beck to Marcos Molitzas and everyone in between sees something very valuable and important in the idea that at that granular level of the one-to-one conversation happening in ordinary places with ordinary people, that something has to change. uh, and so that's been really encouraging and really cool. um, there's other things. I've ended up speaking at some high schools and opening my eyes a bit more to the pressures on the younger generation, and how a lot of them have come up in this crazy political world and feel the weight of that world on their shoulders. And it's just, man, the amount of anxiety when you're that age, um, and how it affects them is pretty wild. And so talking to teachers and faculty about that has been pretty eye-opening. Just the impact of politics as something, that's part of our daily lives, as a worry, as a preoccupation that can invade so much of our daily lives. um, and a lot about social media too, hearing how much kind of heartbreak and people can feel when they end up feeling like they have to burn a bridge, have to burn a relationship, or someone close to them tells them, you can't see this person in the family anymore, I don't want you coming over anymore. Oh, so I've heard a lot more of those stories. I remember one of the critiques that came up in a couple of reviews. One in particular was, man, this book is sure, it's got good stuff, but I wish there were more stories about other people. And I remember reading that and going, I put in all the stories I could find. People don't talk about this very much. But on my tour, it's been like a magnet for all these stories, right? A lot of people have no idea who to talk to about it. They don't know where to go. But it's happening, and there's just not that much of an open conversation. So now I think that's cracked open, and that's really good. We need that.
Yeah, and I personally, like, what I've found is the more that I've tried to go down, like, explore, the more you see it. And I think that there are so many people, like, I've talked with, Republican people who are, on Capitol
Yeah.
Hill as Republicans. I talked to a local Florida politician who's a Republican on this podcast.
Yep.
And but I think the more you try to build the bridges, the more it's there. And it seems that um, I feel like that the media narrative is kind of keeps pushing polarization. Like if you
Yep.
talk about depolarizing, they don't they don't report on depolarizing, which I think goes to the idea of, like, negative news versus positive news. Is that
Yeah.
they don't report on it.
Yeah.
I've looked this up on a couple of media sites, like, where it's like they have people covering politics and polarization, or they have lots of articles about polarization. There's nothing about depolarizing. There's nothing about all the
Yep.
good things that are out there. So to you feel like you're an anomaly if you feel like you want to be depolarized.
Yes.
And I think that's just because of that narrative that's out there. And I don't know for sure. And I guess I ask you, we're talking more about journalism here than I
Mhm.
guess, like, about your book a little bit. But, like, to me, it's like, it seems that journalism kind of focuses on the issues at hand. Like, why should we report on this? Well, it's because it's relevant.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems that, like, I guess another story about a topic that seems to be beaten to death is more compelling than something that's different.
Right. And the reason for that, I think, is that a topic that's been beaten to death, but that there's a hunger for more. I don't know why this came to mind, but I'm thinking of Kanye West right now,
Oh
because
my
there was a
God.
conversation in Braver Angels about should we write about this or do something on it, and I was thinking, man, this is one of those topics that there's lots of people writing about it, but what happens in media is, how can I put this? Um, so long as there is an emotional need, I think, among audiences to try to understand something, or kind of it's like an itch you can't scratch. Why did he do this? What does this even mean? What's going on? You don't know Kanye West. You've never met him. You'll never meet him. But he's bigger than life. He represents all kinds of things. All these different people have put, so much meaning in everything he's saying. And this is how our society works, right? There's influencers. So anyway, it's one of those where you probably can't write enough about Kanye West in a certain moment. So why would you write about something that people don't have an emotional itch to scratch about necessarily, when you could write about something that people have an emotional itch to scratch about? So I think that's what happens a lot of times is media ends up following our psychoses. Media ends up following our obsessions and our preoccupations. But digging into our obsessions and preoccupations is not always good for us.
Yeah.
But there's no economic incentive to do what's good for us. I mean, because the economics of all this work on a very short-term basis. Nobody's figured out the long-term basis. But if we could figure out the long-term basis, then depolarization would be front page every day.
Yeah. Well, the thing that I guess I find exhausting is, like, you'd think that some of the media might learn some lessons, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
you give the mouthpiece and the microphone to the most extreme to get
Mm-hmm.
the eyeballs. And I would like to think that after the last few years, maybe some lessons were learned, especially, from like January 6th. But, like, Kanye West says outrageous things and everybody has to clamor to amplify the message.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I think,
exactly.
I would love them to focus less on Kanye West and more on you and
Yeah.
all the
Well,
people
I was gonna
out
say more
there.
on regular people. I mean, I think what happens is that, you know, it's so funny, isn't it? Like, individual people, individual voices will point to someone who has done something outrageous and say, it matters. And but the thing that ultimately makes it matter is that all those fingers and voices are pointing to it, saying it matters. Like, there is a case to be made. It feels like an alternate universe where the things that just where we can ignore some things, where we can kind of laugh at it and be like, pfft, but we don't know how to do that because our psychoses tend to run the show these days. And a lot of, it's funny because in my audience engagement work, it's always been about, you've got to follow the people and follow the cues of the people. And there's a lot of wonderful things that have come as a result of that. What I'm realizing in this conversation is one of the not so wonderful things that have come out of all of that is follow the fear all the way down, because that's what people want to know. But do we want to spend more time in that fear? And hasn't research shown us that the more that you dwell in your worries, I mean, literally, I'm working with my kids on some of their, worries just as little kids. And we're reading like a book about it together. And it talks about how, yeah, the more time you spend thinking about your worries, the worse they'll get. And we know this about kids. We don't necessarily know this about ourselves. And yeah, the bigger the worries will get, the bigger and more extreme steps you will feel justified in taking to address those worries, which is part of what runs our polarization. So one of the things I've been doing, and I think it's like coming out more as people ask me this, is it's just like, yeah, change the ratio, man. Spend less time looking at this stuff. Spend more time on interactions and relationships in your daily life that fill you up. Like, literally, that just make you happy. And this is not, because I think a lot of people go, that means I'm ignoring the world and it needs me. It's like, you're in the world, don't worry. And the big issues that you care most about, absolutely, like, get in there, right? But if you try to care about everything, I just don't see the good in that. You end up taking the anxiety on yourself. It becomes bigger than life. you spread it to your family and to your friends. And before you know it, you're all walking around, I don't know, seeing monsters around every corner. And I don't know that that's a great way to live. Um, yeah. So we have to kind of balance, we care about truth, right? So what is the truth of how afraid we ought to be?
Yeah.
I'd like to be curious about that. How afraid is, how much fear is justified?
Yeah. Yeah. And the reality is it's always going to be out there. We're never. I think the other factor is like you see, whatever you resolve, there's always going to be a new problem. So I think and maybe the fact of the matter is the internet is here to stay,
Oh, yeah.
and we're always going to be inundated with more. And I think in many respects what we're going through is not like, I don't condemn our generation like we're weaker. We are confronted with probably the most revolutionary invention of humanity,
Yeah.
and we're all trying to adapt as we can, and
Yeah.
it's gonna take a while. But I,
And
I
you know
think
what I'm thinking actually is like, is yeah. So when I started in journalism, it was right when social media was getting really important. So I ended up playing a role in helping my fellow journalists understand how to use social media and why it was really great and why you don't have to worry about the pedophiles on MySpace and like everything's gonna be fine. And not only that, but it's gonna save our democracy. This is awesome, guys. And then I've witnessed all the ways in which it kind of isn't awesome. Once all of humanity populated these places, all of our good and bad populated these spaces too. And so now I'm thinking, maybe there's a cyclical nature. And it's not just sort of what technology is going to save us. Maybe the cyclical thing is a technology comes around, changes everything faster than we can notice what's going on. And then we need time to adapt and build a culture that equalizes its power. So that's what I hope and think is happening now. That media has run amok and done these things and followed the incentives and followed the technology, and so has social media and all these platforms, and they're following our psychoses, and we're running behind. But maybe, just maybe, this rising awareness and how our anxiety's gone up, and this rising awareness on how we've become consumed by politics and all these things, maybe it's leading us to build internal resilience, which will also lead us to change our culture. Because technology is no match for culture. It's just that nobody can control culture. You can't create culture the way you can create a new product. So that's you said you ended the show by asking what people would give people hope at the end of the day, and every day it's different for me. But I think the hope that I have today is I do think that we can change our culture. It always feels so hopeless and helpless, but we do it when we don't even notice it. By deciding what matters, and I think more and more people are deciding I should make some choices about how I spend my attention and my time and my conversation. I should make choices. I should not just go on the default factory settings of the tools and technologies at my disposal.
yeah, yeah, that's great. Right. Well, I know you've got a hard stop, so Monica, thank you. Thanks so much for doing this, and thanks for working through some of our technical glitches early on.
Yeah.
But it's your. I think the notion of like service to the country gets very kind of narrowly applied to like military, and I think one of the things that I've
Mhm.
also kind of come to realize is that you can serve your country in lots of other broad ways, and I think that you're doing some really amazing service to the country. So I mean, thank you for your diligence, perseverance, vision, and continuing efforts to make it a better nation.
Oh, thank you, Michael, and thank you because you're doing some amazing stuff yourself. Like that. I mean, I was talking about changing culture. You're doing it. That's what it's all about. So I'm really excited for all your work. Uh, let's go. Like my son says, like my 10-year-olds, let's go.
All right, yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much, Monica.
Thanks, Michael.
And thank you to our listeners. May you go out and explore our country with curiosity, respect, compassion, and humility. All right, take care and have a happy holidays.